People who have been homeless, what was the first night without a home like, and how did you adapt to your new situation?
I was about 9 years old, and my mom said we were going on a camping trip. I didn't really suspect anything, as it was summertime and we went camping a lot when I was younger. Although I did wonder why we were packing so much stuff. After a few weeks of camping, I started to complain, but my mom kept insisting that it was good for us to get in touch with nature, etc. Then school started, and we were still camping. And we kept camping for another 6 months. When we finally got a house, my mom cried with joy. And we don't camp anymore.
I remember being really hungry and acting weird because of the low blood sugar, almost delirious. This was when I made a futile attempt to run away from an abusive home with no money. I ended up going back because of that.
I was homeless for a couple of months a year or two ago. I had a car and a low-paying job, so I lived in the woods in a tent for a bit. The first night was miserable. I ended up sleeping really uncomfortably in the passenger seat of my car, and it was a really cold night. After that I got a tent and slept on the old climbing pad I had. The first night was hell, but the next several weeks were actually not so bad. I had a spot in the woods where I was well hidden and would cook over a fire. I really didn't have it that bad, but it gave me quite a bit of sympathy for people who really do end up on the streets in a much more desperate situation. Shit is not easy.
Sleeping in my car wasn't that bad. It was summer, so it was pretty warm, which was my biggest issue. Showered in the gym, and spent most of my day at the library before going to work. For the first few nights it wasn't bad. However, one night police found me sleeping in my car and escorted me to the local homeless shelter, which was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. Since I'm lying there in a top bunk, when a huge argument breaks out because one guy breaks out some meth, wouldn't share it with a second, then a third got pissed and started screaming at them to be quiet because he needed to sleep. Edit, since this is coming up a lot, people keep asking how it was legal that the police escorted me to the shelter. I don't know the legality of the issue. What I can say is that I was woken up by a knock on my window to see 4 cops, 2 cop cars. They were singing those super bright flashlights through my window at me, and I didn't even think of arguing with them.
I was kicked out by my mother at 16 and spent 2 months homeless before the local authority placed me in foster care. I think what hit me first was how my own mother could make one of her own children homeless. I felt like the least favorite of her children. It all came out of nowhere. I racked my brain for years after, trying to think of what I might have done in particular. Also, the crippling loneliness you feel when you are trying to get hold of people to ask for a place to sleep for the night. I could not feel more alone in the world when someone would either not answer my message or tell me they were busy. I'm pretty sure I camped out in the park that night. Didn't sleep at all.
Slept in my vehicle, couch surfed with a friend, squatted in an unused trailer, all while still working at a Walmart. Saved enough to get a crappy apartment and just kept going from there.
It was terrifying and cold and hungry. I didn't sleep a wink. I adapted over time. Extremely steep learning curve to surviving homelessness. Nothing really prepares you for it.
I kept waking up in the middle of the night and would start walking home. I'd get a few steps, then stop and realize I had nowhere to go and turn and walk back over and lay on the ground. The ground is very cold and I felt a lot of shame.
When I was a teenager, I had lots of problems with my mom. I pretty much chose to be homeless. I slept at a Catholic church across from my high school so I could still make it to school and graduate early. I remember feeling really sad because I slept where they put people's ashes, and I remember being so sad that those people could comfort me in death more than anybody alive. I used to talk to them. If there's camera footage, I look insane. I never realized how alone I was in the world until I was homeless. And I never realized how cold concrete can be. It chills you right to your bones and is painful.
I was getting high, so it really didn't truly sink in until I was broke and dope sick. Then the desperation started. going to gas stations, jumping car to car asking for money, stealing what I had to. It was a miserable existence. There are so many things you don't think about when you're not homeless. Taking a shower, washing your clothes, and the boredom. Hours upon hours of nothing to do. And the constant noise. There was nowhere to go where it was truly quiet. Fortunately, I eventually got arrested for shoplifting, reached out to family who helped me get back on my feet.
I didn't really realize what was going on. I was about 6-7 at the time. Dad said we were going to go for a drive and to pack my backpack with all the clothes I could fit and one toy. Mom was just crying. Me and my brother sat in the back seat. He was a little older and was holding our Sega Genesis and looking scared. We drove for a little while. It was already getting dark, and we parked in front of a Walmart, and Dad said he had to rest for a while. Was the first of many many nights we slept in the car. I remember one of my parents was always awake, with their hand in their coat pocket. Looking back, it was obvious they had a gun for protection, sleeping in shifts. Edit, Jesus, this blew up and thanks for the gold. Trying to respond to all but my poor inbox. Edit 2, WTF guys, 3 gold? Thank you.
My ex-wife made up a bunch of shit to get a restraining order. I got served at work while she simultaneously shut off my phone service and locked me out of our shared bank account. This was Jan 7, 2016. I had a t-shirt and slacks to wear for clothes, and nowhere to sleep. My car didn't have working heat. Thank God for my parents who got me a hotel, new phone, and some money for clothes. I ended up living in an extended stay hotel for 2 months while I looked for an apartment, and got my affairs in order. The restraining order was dismissed, the divorce went to trial, and I got the house and the kids.
I was homeless for a little while in the 80s. It's terrifying at first. You feel so unsafe. I was a teenager, and wasn't willing to close my eyes and sleep on a park bench alone. So, I went to a local shelter and lied about my age. They forced me to shower and do a pee test. It turns out the women in that shelter were scarier than the streets, so the next night I didn't go back. I slept in a park but ultimately made squatter friends and stayed with them. It was very much a community and I felt safe and loved there. The biggest problem with being homeless in the city is no one wants to let you use the bathroom. Even park bathrooms are locked. Squat peeing in between cars can be done quickly and undercover, but when you get your period it's a nightmare. These days I have stability, so I never pass a homeless person without buying them some food or giving them a little money. And if they use it for drugs or alcohol, I don't care. Living on the streets is hard. Drink if you need to, my friend.
I don't recall my very first time exactly. I do remember looking for a friend that was homeless and his friends ended up watching over me. Everyone was drunk except me. I didn't sleep. More recently, less than a month ago, I lost my housing and everything I own. I'm alone this time. I sleep during the day and browse Reddit at night. I was homeless for 10 years the first time. And I am terrified now. First thing I realized, at 18 when leaving home and finding myself stranded straight away, is that I wasn't as unlucky as I had always thought. Female, young and normal looking, got support from loads of random people who deemed me very brave. It hit me really hard that if I was fat, or a guy, I would have been screwed. I lived in Spain by then and a couple of nights at a park was quite exciting. Just a couple of nights is what it took to get emergency accommodation, and nobody bothered me. Then jumped from shit job to shit job for a few weeks, ended up getting a year-long apprenticeship selling shoes. Second, I learned that hitchhiking is very cheap and pretty safe in Europe. Just kept clean looks, did loads of workaway placements and slowly got on my feet. I am 28 now and settling down in Cornwall, UK. Which is the nicest place where I could ever imagine living equals.
I feel like I'm too late to the party, but I was actually born homeless. My mom put newborn me into a small laundry basket filled with blankets she'd been gifted. I spent the first year of my life living out of a car with my family. My mom had my 5-year-old brother and 4-year-old sister with her, too. All living out of a grand caravan in the early 90s. She'd taken us to Wyoming to hide in the Rocky Mountains, so, at least I got to sleep under the stars at night. I've been homeless most of my life. I have stories about that if anyone finds this and is interested.
I was 18 and had depression. Only had to do the final exams and I would have been good to go. But I panicked and didn't attend, which caused me to fail, of course. Me failing made my depression even worse. My parents couldn't take it anymore, packed my clothes in a case and set me on the street. I had no idea where to go and didn't want to sleep in the city like most homeless do because I was too afraid of something happening to me or the few things I had while I sleep. So I went deep into the woods, opened the case with my clothes and curled up in there to sleep. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. I was just too disappointed in myself for being such a failure and cried a lot. Thank God I wasn't homeless long before my grandparents took me in until I found a job. When I had a job, my parents took me back in and I went into therapy. I'm good now, but getting abandoned by my parents when I needed them the most still hurts to this day.
I was only 13. The first night I had to just turn the fear into strength. It got easier and easier every day. I figured out how to get clean, where to sleep, where to eat. It was easier to get used to than when I got a home again and had to get used to staying in a house again.
Slept in the back seat of my friend's broken down VW Beetle. Used the light from the street light to study and get my homework done on time. Later on, that same friend would sneak me into his dad's camper at night so I could actually lay out flat and get a good night's sleep. That worked for a while until I got caught and his dad kicked us both out. Went back to sleeping in the bug. Got by using old airline toiletries and washing up in the public restrooms by the beach and nearby Burger King. Still made the dean's list though.
I think people have this idea in their head that homeless means you're out on the street under a bridge or in a tent, but there are many facets of it. We were homeless for about 10 days after my mom left my dad. I was younger and it didn't click with me until I got older. Mom called me and my sisters and told us to pack up our stuff. We then just did what we needed to got those 10 days until she could secure some housing for us. I remember eating corn and rice for a meal, but that's the only real thing that sticks out to me from that time.
Honestly, it wasn't too bad for me. I got kicked out but lived in a good area. I had a car, so I just parked it in parks and stuff, and it was only about 2 weeks before I found a new place to stay. It was also just me at the time, so I really didn't mind too much. Not all cases are like this though. It was temporary and I was lucky enough to have a car, a job where I could shower and spend most my days and nights at work. I worked at a kennel and theater, so I generally didn't get off until 2 and was at work by 6, so I wasn't in my car much anyways. It was also the early spring, so it wasn't too hot and wasn't too cold. I was lucky.
It didn't really occur to me that I was homeless for a couple weeks. I was 16, and my mom and I were in a domestic abuse situation. She fled to a friend's house, and I fled to my friend's house, and then from there, sofa surfed for a few weeks until my boyfriend's mom caught on that something wasn't quite right. I had spent random nights at their house prior in the spare room, but during that 2 weeks I had stayed 3 times with them, and at dinner she gently put down her fork and goes, "Sarah, something is going on. Tell me about it." It wasn't a question. So I started bawling at the dinner table and realized I didn't have a home, and in the next 5 minutes, me, her, my boyfriend, and his dad all had our shoes on and in the car, on our way to the abusive house to grab my things. Then they made the spare room my real room for a year before I could go to university and get an apartment.
The first time, I had to live in a motel for half a year. Each night was the same as the last. Cramped, upsetting, but dry and safe. The second time, I got lucky and was already staying at my grandparents' house the night when I became homeless again. Thankfully, they allowed me to stay until I eventually got a new home. The first night there was blissful peace and ignorance.
I had no clue I was homeless. I went to stay the night at a friend's house on a weekday, and after not feeling hated for existing, I just didn't go back. I ended up couch surfing for 2-ish years until college hit.
I was 17. I hit a car with my dad's Corvette. It wasn't that big of a deal, it was just a little damage to the front. Well, the guy I hit called my dad before I got home and told him a bunch of BS. Said his bumper fell off of his car and read my dad the riot act. When I got home, I walked through the front door, my dad hit me in the chest and knocked me back through the doorway. He screamed at me and told me to get out of his life. I went to the Redondo Beach Pier where I hung out and stared sleeping under the pier. The first night, and most nights after that, were a series of moments of having no idea what to do. I was lost. After 7 months I called my maternal grandparents and asked them for help. They moved me back to Arizona and got me into college. Edit man, I haven't thought of that in years. A sudden wave of emotion just washed over me. I miss my grandma and grandpa. They were so good to me.
I lived in a minivan for half a year while I worked full-time at an airport. The trick was not to actually leave when the shift ended. For if I left, I wouldn't go super far. I could afford to eat a couple times a day, and I had a cheap gym membership so that I could shower. The boredom was mind-numbing, but if it got too bad I would just go back to the airport and people watch or pretend like I was about to fly somewhere. Never missed my family so much. Eventually gave up and moved back home.
I was 20 at the time, and it was the dead of winter. My first night was lots of why does no one care? Where will I sleep? How will I eat? Fuck, it's cold. Why me? Is this the end? The first night, I walked to each one of my friends' houses and eventually found one with their car unlocked. I slept in the back seat of their Honda and made sure to set an alarm on my watch to wake up before they left for work. It was shady, but to this day I'm grateful they left their car unlocked. A week or so later, I called family to see if I could spend Christmas with them. It was a resounding no from all parties. I cried. A lot. It really broke me. That situation lasted for a little over a month. It pressured me to get clean off the drugs I was using. I was confident that I would die, or commit suicide, if I had to live that way for any longer. Been clean 7 years now. Being homeless humbled me. I'm no longer the arrogant, selfish asshole that put himself in that situation.
I've been homeless twice, but both times I managed to secure a temporary place to sleep after a couple of days. Those days, though, were among the worst I've ever experienced. It's just a sense of panic and feeling exposed and unsafe, and every time you go inside you tell yourself to enjoy it for as long as they'll let you because it's raining and windy outside and you know you'll soon be back out in it. I have no doubt that if I had to do it for longer in either instance I probably wouldn't have survived it, one way or the other. So I can't answer the adapting to it part, but thought I'd share what I do know anyway.
It sucked. It was freezing. I learned how to start a fire with very little supplies though. Tortilla chips, Doritos are great fire starters. Once I acquired a tent it was much more tolerable.
It was quite brief. I lived with my grandmother until she died, just after I turned 18. The building society, like a bank, had refused to let me have anything to do with her house and opted to evict me. So I did. The last week was madness trying to get all my stuff out. I gave loads away to different people. I had a tiny flat lined up, but that was taking longer than expected and the eviction date loomed. The bailiffs wouldn't extend further. So they came, took my keys, and that was it. I was homeless, albeit briefly. But I had a set of spare keys, so I just let myself in and slept in a sleeping bag on the floor, with our dog, until the flat was ready, with everything I could squeeze into my car in there. The rest of my stuff was tipped, but that's life sometimes. I did go through a period of being of no fixed abode for a while a year or so later, as I screwed up on the flat and had no idea how to manage my money properly. Eventually got that sorted too, but it's a rubbish lifestyle.
I walked for as long as I could and passed out on a bench in front of a church. So someone woke me up and asked if I was okay in the morning, and I explained the situation, and then they told me to leave since it was private property and there would be people there soon and they didn't want me making the place look bad. As soon as the words left his mouth, I realized that I was already viewed as less than human after one night. I ended up going to work still, as I never told them I was kicked out of my home, and showering at the local community college since they never checked to see if the people using the gym were students. Eventually I got back on my feet, and even now that I'm not homeless I still feel that way inside often, like I'm less than human.
My first day of being homeless, I had to bring my son and parents to the airport. I had to make sure my son would be well, so I decided to let him live with my parents, who came to pick him up. It was awful. But, I also timed it so I wouldn't feel the awfulness of being split from my son. I went surfing the same day and stayed out of town with a friend. After the short surf trip, I was truly homeless. And temporarily childless. I messaged a friend to let me stay the night. The first of many nights. I also arranged to stay with another friend and her family. It was July. I only had summer clothes. I needed to be able to get my shit together before it got colder. So maybe I wasn't out on the streets, but I still had no permanent home. It wasn't as bad as the others posted on here.
The extremes most people here are describing are actually only the pointed end of homelessness. Far more people lack their own personal private safe space, but do have places to crash. Maybe it's on a family member or friend's couch. Not roughing it, but not necessarily super secure or their own. This applies to massive numbers of people. And it's good when we have such charity and support networks, but it helps to mask the scope of the issue, which is far larger than it usually appears.
The closest I got to being homeless was when I was 19. I was kicked out by my old landlord because he wanted to do renovations to be able to justify raising the rent to other, more well-off tenants. The first night I slept in my car, after that a mate of mine let me crash at his place. So, I spent 6 months sleeping on my mate's couch. Does that count?
It was surreal. I was at one of my lower points, freshly 21, and I met a bunch of people that traveled with Renaissance festivals. So when my lease was up, and I didn't find a new apartment, I went to the campground where all these vagabonds were staying and ended up staying in a guy's doghouse next to his tent, that he had constructed out of tarps and scrap wood, with his dogs. Overall the night was good, for I still had my Adderall and money for liquor. I ended up traveling with those people for a few years, working rent fairs, partying, seeing the different parts of the US, just being completely free.
When I was in grade 9, my mom had finally gotten out of an abusive relationship. Her friend from work let us stay at their house for about a month, then we had to move into a battered women's shelter for about 6 months. We had a big room with 4 beds in each room and a pin pad to get into the room. Being 14 years old, I definitely knew what was going on and was pretty embarrassed by it and didn't tell anyone what we were going through. My mom, sister and I were still all together though, so it could have been a lot worse. In the end we bought a house, are all in good places now. If anyone's interested I can go into more detail about stuff. Edit, spelling mistake.
My experience may kinda differ, and it was actually recently I was homeless. I was in a rough financial situation, so I used the last bit of money on a tent, a lock, some food and a bunch of plastic bottles of vodka. I worked a kitchen job with a woodsy area next to it and set up my tent out there. I basically just hang around the woods, fucking off, climbing trees, trying to build various things until I had to work. Went to work, came back to the tent, put a lock on the zippers and drank myself to sleep watching YouTube. I'd charge my phone at work. I had a Planet Fitness membership since it was $15 a month. Go to the gym to shower and all that. After a couple months I'd saved up enough for a place in a new state.
I grew up busking and begging because my druggy parents couldn't remember to take care of me. I knew most of the homeless in my area because of that, so when I ran away I knew things like who to talk to and where to bunker down. It was quiet compared to the constant outbursts of crazy and violence with my parents. I felt safer because most of the more respected homeless people had known me close to a decade and made everyone leave me alone.
Absolutely sucked and still does. I slept in a shopping mall that happened to be open all night. The next day I was able to get in supported housing that is shared with other people. Fortunately my phone is paid off and I have unlimited data, so that gives me something to do, as I was big into gaming before all the shit happened. I'm currently living on one bowl of oats a day until next week, when hopefully I receive some government help. I don't take drugs, drink alcohol, and I have no possessions to sell for food. The thought of eating something such as pizza or a roast dinner sounds so amazing, but it's so far away that I try not to think about it. I spend my time watching streamers and browsing Reddit. You would no believe the amount of reposts when you spend so much time on here lol.